Thank you very much. What I'm planning to do in this session is perhaps to talk about open and distance education from a slightly different perspective from the one that Belinda's just enunciated. And that is, I guess, not from the perspective of a practitioner, but from the perspective of governments and people who are looking at public policy, an attempt to see where this conference might fit in to broader international and national responses to the various pressures that governments are facing. So what I'm going to do is do a pretty quick overview of what might be, at this moment, the international context for higher education, what's happening in Australia very rapidly, but then go on to what might be some of the implications, both in Australia, but more particularly internationally, for open and distance education. So if I can start by just putting this up and saying that it's a kind of truism now that knowledge is seen to be a major resource of governments. I'd have to say that 3 and 4 years ago now, when we started the review of higher education in Australia, interestingly enough, it largely was not seen that higher education had a major role in productivity. Higher education was largely seen to be something that stood apart from the productivity agenda, which is largely discussed in relation to vocational education and training. But indeed, I think that view is changing, though I'd have to say I suspect that generally the education sector has not argued this very well. They tend to fight their own fights within the sector rather than arguing with government about the way in which the sector might contribute to broader national goals. So what internationally are the implications of an argument that is now widely accepted by international bodies and by governments, that central to the productivity of nations is the capacity to produce and disseminate knowledge. Now, it is now seen by all countries that there is a competitive advantage for nations, not just in the skills, but the level of skills. So the push all the time is for a larger proportion of the population to get a higher level of skills. And it's now beginning to be seen by governments, though I have to say not always by people in the sector, that universities are central to national competitiveness, both as knowledge producers in the work they do in research and as disseminators in the work they do in teaching. That's a mixed blessing, because the result of that there is unprecedented interest by governments internationally on what individual universities do and how well they perform. And we're both in research and in teaching, and those of us who've worked in universities, I guess in the 18 countries represented in front of me, will have experienced the effect of that interest by government in what universities do and how well they're doing it. Going along with that too is that the population has become quite convinced that university qualifications, higher level qualifications, are critical for personal success. So what are the implications then for nation states? That's the broader context. What we're seeing across the world is that participation in higher education is rising in response both to these national and the individual pressures to increase qualification levels. And if I might say, in many countries, participation in vocational education and training is falling. So people are going after the higher level of qualification and they're seeking pathways into the higher level of qualification. But there are concerns everywhere about the public costs of maintaining both research competitiveness and supporting rises in participation. And every country is grappling with the question of how the costs of both of these things Because if you think that knowledge production is important, as well as knowledge dissemination, then you're inevitably very, very interested in research. But along with that, in every country, there are concerns about the impact on the quality of provision, on the support for students, and the outcomes for students as the numbers increase. In every country across the world. I mean, I've just recently been in Japan, where they're as worried about this issue as we are in Australia. In Japan, what they worry about is how can we be sure that if a student enrolls in a degree in accountancy in this university, that they have the same threshold requirements and outcomes as a student who enrolled in that university as the numbers increase and the traditional kind of controls, such as they were, I think we glorify them a little bit, but that's another story, begin to fall away. And there is everywhere some public concern, never quite sure how real it is. I think the pressures for individual competition are probably much greater than they are for social concern, about differential access to higher education between social groups. And in most countries there's a concern about the fact that higher level qualifications are still largely a middle class good with very poor access to that good for people from lower socioeconomic groups or from particular groups in the community, like the people who just welcomed you to their country. So what are some of the public policy responses that we're seeing internationally to this wonderful thing that everybody thinks that education is important and governments think education is important, but then they have to grapple with the fact of how they can spread the joy around the community. So what we're seeing internationally is governments are seeking to contain the costs of expansion and indeed the costs of research by a range of pretty common broad responses. The ways in which they operate in particular countries relates obviously to the history and the context in that country. So they increase the student contribution. So the big debate, underlying debate in most countries, particularly about higher education, of what is the individual advantage as against what is the public advantage to somebody getting a university qualification, and how much should the individual contribute to it as against how much should the public purse contribute to it. And that's currently in very stark relief in the UK, as the Brown report is, in the process, presumably, of implementation, to the amazement of many of us. What we're also seeing is arguments for the differentiation of institutional roles, particularly in higher education. In some countries, that differentiation's been in place. There are teaching-only institutions, public institutions, research-intensive public institutions. That debate is on in different ways across the world. And it's a particularly interesting debate in this country at the present moment. And of course, as in all other areas of public policy, this issue of the fine-tuning of funding is related to the development of more stringent performance measures. They go together. You get the money if you produce the outcomes that are necessary, and governments everywhere are moving to more tighter performance measures and often more targeted programmatic funding, and leaving less room for institutions to cross-subsidise areas of their activities. So that's just as it's happening in health, as it's happening in all public policy areas. But what we're certainly seeing in most countries too is the encouragement of private provision. Australia is relatively unusual in that it's been largely a public system. That's not true in many other countries. But the government has, people may be surprised to know that there are now about 170 private providers of higher education in Australia. There are 40 universities and there are 170 other institutions that provide higher education. And that's a pattern in many other places too. And then, of course, what largely happens is you encourage private provision and then they begin to lobby for a public subsidy, but that's another argument. And what is happening, and is particularly relevant to the group of people in front of me, is that across the world there's been this naive belief that ICT will be the answer and to economising on delivery costs. And I don't think I need to belabour that point, but it's a beloved view of governments and senior bureaucrats. And I think you could say they're generalisations across the world of what the broader response has been. But there's another group of people out there, and as this world changes, what are the students thinking? Well, first of all, and everybody's encountered this if they've had the length of career that I've had, the students are positioning themselves now as customers and they want good service. And what do they mean by that? I'll say in a moment. We're also seeing largely, even in many Asian countries where 10, 15 years ago this was fairly unusual, that the full-time on-campus student is becoming rarer. And even if they are full-time on campus, they're very commonly, because of the shifting of costs and the lowering of the numbers of scholarships, etc., they're working. So you've really got a student population that is different from the one that, I'm older than most of the people here, but often different from the one that many people who work in institutions have in their head. When we were doing the review of higher education and we're doing consultations in Australia, in every consultation at some point we would have to say to our colleagues from the higher education sector, you talk about students as though they're the kind of students that were in universities when you were doing your undergraduate degree, given your age profile largely of the group you were talking to, because they were generally fairly senior people. You know, statistically, that is not true. That is not the average Australian higher education student. They've changed. And of course, as a former Vice-Chancellor, what I know is that what they want is both high-tech and high-touch and instant response. Instant personal response as well as the most immediate technological capacity simultaneously, which is one of the reasons why it's very difficult dealing with government, who seem to think that you can deal with them as atomised creatures who don't actually want to relate to anybody. So what's happening here in Australia? I mean, the situation in response to these broad pressures is different in different places. So, sorry, people from overseas, I'll just do a quick run through of what I think is happening in Australia. The government has accepted the productivity argument. The government's response to the review of higher education was to accept that, in broad terms, higher education is central to the development of national productivity, and that argument has been accepted. It hasn't always been accepted in other countries. And as of this moment, but let's wait till the May budget, higher education is still seen in this country as a public good, unlike the UK, where it is now seen as an individual good if you're doing arts or social science degrees. And the increased numbers recommended by the review of higher education will be funded. But there is currently a review of the funding regime underway. The government also accepted a need to take action on the participation of marginalised groups, and there's been, in my view, very good response across the higher education sector to that. It's a very difficult issue, but I believe that all universities have made quite a serious effort to try and work out how in their local community they can deal with that public policy desired by the government. But at the same time, and I think it's actually really important for people in this group to come to grips with this, there is a major focus in this country and in most countries on research performance and research funding. And it has huge implications for those members of universities whose major interest is in the teaching mission. And there's concerns here, though. There are also concerns which have now been exacerbated by the nature of the current government, which is a minority government in this country, about the participation, access and outcomes of rural and remote communities. The growth in private provision here has been supported, though the introduction of a tertiary regulator will change the relationship of those private providers to government in various ways. And I would say, this is very much my view, that dual mode, it seems to me obvious that dual mode institutions as we once knew them in Australia, institutions that had one set of arrangements for on-campus students and one set of arrangements for distant students are gone, and what we generally have is flexible delivery to all is now the norm across Australia, with, I think, and I'll come to that, some serious implications. Even though I drove it at the University of South Australia, but that's another argument. You can still say, is it still the right way to go for everybody? So let's talk now about your world. It seems to me, if you're working in open and distance delivery anywhere in the world, that the new focus, the renewed focus on research reinforces existing status gulfs inside institutions and between institutions, and raises real questions about people's careers, where they want to position themselves, if they're a good academic. Is this an area in which you'd want to work? And to go on to that, across the world, it would be naive to say that there is not in every country a significant status gulf between research-intensive institutions that largely cater to a full-time undergraduate teaching population on campus, and other institutions that teach a predominantly it's different in different countries, open universities as they are in some countries, mixed mode kind of institutions. It's different in different countries. But the gulf is either there, and everybody understands it's there, but it's not reinforced, or it is actually reinforced by the title of the institution, the use of the U word, by the funding levels. Some are funded obviously the ones that are full-time research intensive are richer, and often the requirements of the accreditation or registration regime in the country. So it would be naive of people working in this sector not to accept that there are issues about where it sits in the status hierarchy of this highly competitive and status-obsessed sector. I also think that it's quite clear that there is competition from private teaching-only providers who are doing two things. They're exploiting economies of scale, focusing just on one or two areas and getting big numbers and putting in good processes to support those students, or going into partnerships with professional associations or whoever it might be to service their members. And it does seem to me in Australia and probably around the world that what's happened here in Australia to the public schools is a real danger for public institutions dealing with off-campus students or part-time students, that they'll be left with the really expensive or very difficult groups to support rather than being able to use the economies of scale. I think that's actually to some extent already happening. I think too that there are some very big issues, and certainly when we were doing the review of higher education, the lack of any really sharp, clear picture of the real costs of delivery models is a real disadvantage for people working in this area. The fact that it is very, very difficult to get a hold on, for example, in Australia, what might be a fair cost for the delivery of a program in a small regional centre using the TAFE facilities as your base is a serious issue in terms of public policy. It's not an attractive issue. People are perhaps not very interested in it, but the lack of that kind of information makes it extremely difficult to argue for different models of delivery. And I think that, to go back to the arguments I've been putting about the status of the area, that there is going to be an international battle for English-speaking staff over the next 1 or 2 decades, and those institutions that are high status will do rather better in that war than those that aren't. And that has implications, it seems to me, for people working in this field as well. So what next given that, what do I think are some of the issues you should be thinking about here over the next couple of days? I actually think that this is, like most areas, one where people comfort each other with, and themselves, with having the same conversation and no doubt feeling oppressed because things are difficult, and get together in something like this to say, aren't we all suffering, isn't it not fair? And I think a bit more of the, what can we do to be sharper as a community which is actually advocating for a particular form of education would be good. And that actually means that there's a need to be pretty honest about what the field is doing well, what researchers and practitioners are doing well, what they're doing badly, what are the real issues that they're actually fighting. That means, I think, ramping up to some of the policy issues rather than ramping down to the practical issues. I also think many of the institutions represented in this room face an issue about deciding what game they're in. Particularly if they are servicing an open and distance education clientele, how central is it to their mission, a whole range of issues like that. I think that is something that needs to get much more on the agenda of institutions, and perhaps it means, certainly in Australia, I believe, a number of institutions should move out of the game. We should actually concentrate into a smaller number of institutions. So I think that's the second thing. And that's not so much about here, but it is about your role in your own institutions. My own view is that then connects to where the debate's been in this field for some time. I'm not convinced that flexible delivery for all is obviously the correct decision for many institutions, but I think there are some that have actually got to decide that they're really into a modern version of open and distance education, and that's a different game, it seems to me, in terms of where you put your resources to build your systems and develop your staff. And I mean, one of the things, and I'll just make the statement about Australia, I mean, one of the things that I thought was really startling during and after the review of higher education was, my own view was, the government would have been in the game of putting a significant amount of money into supporting a new model of distance education if the major, largely regional providers had stopped quarrelling and competing with each other on such a scale that we got like diddly squat out of it as a result. And I think that is a kind of major issue. Unless the institutions are able to see that collaboration is the only way, given the issues about scale, that they're going to be able, first of all, to build a respectable research base in this area so that you're all going to get your stuff into, what we call in Australia era. So we're going to be able to do that. But also to kind of build scale and get lobbying strength with governments. It's absolutely critical in this country, but I think it's probably the case across the world. In this area, governments do want a solution, but they're not going to fund one institution to be the solution. So it requires a different approach to the field and a kind of collaboration on the ground and collaboration at the point of lobbying. So there are some thoughts of mine about where you might like to talk and think over the next few days, and I wish you good luck.